Hello, everyone, and good evening. My name is Catherine Lee, and I'm an associate professor at the Johns Hopkins University School of Nursing, and I want to welcome you to our town hall tonight speaking about compassion fatigue. We have three incredible panelists who will be having a dialogue with to get into this topic, and I'll introduce them to you. Please, if you have any questions, type them into the chat. The second half of our conversation will be directly with you. So first of all, I want to introduce my esteemed colleague, Dr. Annette Anderson. She currently serves as an assistant professor and lead faculty for school administration and supervision in the School of Education at Johns Hopkins. She is also deputy director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Safe and Healthy Schools and one of the three co-founders of the eSchool Plus initiative. She also supports the Hopkins HEAT Corps, the Health Education and Training Group, as a curriculum liaison. Dr. Anderson has served in a variety of school-based positions, including classroom teacher, teacher lead, curriculum coordinator, and assistant principal. She earned her bachelor's degree from the Syracuse University, a master's degree in public health and public policy from Georgetown University, a second master's degree and PhD in education policy from the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome, Dr. Anderson.
Good evening, Dr. Ling. It's so good to be here with you.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Janice Goldwater, a licensed clinical social worker. She is the founder and CEO of Adoptions Together, Family Works Together, an organization focusing on family well-being by creating and strengthening permanency for youth and their families. With an attachment-focused, trauma-informed lens, the agency provides a broad spectrum of clinical, educational, and transformational services to strengthen relationships in first families, kinship, foster, and adoptive families, and the communities who support them. Janice founded the organization in 1990 and has been primarily responsible for its growth and development to identify needs in the community and to create opportunities to address them. She is appointed as a member of the Maryland State Council on Child Abuse and Neglect, the State Council, and serves as the co-chair of the training work group for the Maryland Trauma Informed Commission. As an adoptive parent of an older child who experienced profound maltreatment, she has utilized community-based services to support her child and family into effectively reaching adulthood. Welcome, Janice. Thank you so much for spending some time with us.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. And our final panelist is Dr. Tamar Rodney. Dr. Rodney is an assistant professor at the Johns Hopkins University School of Nursing. She is a board-certified psychiatric nurse practitioner who has worked in trauma and psychiatry. She is the track coordinator for the Psychiatric Mental Health Nurse Practitioner Certificate Program and the DNP Psychiatric Mental Health Nurse Practitioner programs at the School of Nursing. She maintains clinical practice in Baltimore City, serving families recovering from substance use. Her research includes identifying biomarkers for PTSD in individuals with a history of traumatic brain injury and addressing coping issues for students with mental health needs. Welcome, Dr. Rodney.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be with my colleagues this evening.
Fantastic. Well, we're going to have a wonderful discussion. We'll go ahead and jump right in. Again, remember, if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. We'll address them shortly. So let's just go ahead and start off with, what is compassion fatigue? Anyone?
Compassion fatigue is the state of exhaustion biologically, psychologically, and socially that happens to us when we are exposed to trauma and stress and difficult circumstances. And it happens when we take in more than, when we take in more than we have protected ourselves from. So we become exhausted and feel helpless, hopeless, and powerless.
I would also add that I think that compassion fatigue really goes at the notion that we are supposed to have compassion. And so that fires us up to try to be helpers in everything that we are doing. And so helping your family, helping your friends, helping your colleagues, helping your coworkers comes at a price at a certain point, because if you're not taking care of yourself, you will become exhausted. So the compassion fatigue piece really focuses first on the giving. So you have to be in a state of perpetual giving to get to the place where you're exhausted by the compassion.
And the only thing I'll add to that is that independently, both of them, being able to feel both of those are good things. They're necessary things. So compassion, obviously we want to be compassionate toward others, and being able to recognize that there's fatigue in whatever you're doing is also a protective mechanism. So while it can be detrimental, it's also very useful in making decisions. So recognizing when it's happening and that it is happening is another key piece. But so taken together, it's a very negative cycle, but independently, it's a part of our natural way of life.
All of these are fantastic points. Why do you think over the last 3 years, we as a collective society have overexerted ourselves?
Well, I would just jump in to say that I think that there's been a collective call to arms. Whenever there have been wars or whenever there have been natural disasters, people feel called upon to help in whatever way they can. So when the pandemic was first declared, you had people trying to sew masks, you had people trying to give blood. There were all kinds of responses in that moment that people really felt obligated to do because they wanted to help. We want to be good people in the world. And so giving of yourself in that way, whether you were trying to make masks or whether you were helping at the local food pantry or whether you were helping in a school that was online by trying to support those students and those teachers, those are the types of things that people want to do in order to help society to heal and to rebound and to be better. The challenge becomes when this goes on for an extended period of time, you don't have the same amount of energy to expend as you did in the beginning when you had all of that adrenaline that was pushing you to try to be a positive change maker. So that's where the fatigue sets in.
I
No,
think it
that's a good point. Go
it
ahead.
also, our brain craves certainty. Our social brain craves certainty. We want to know what's going to happen. And at first in the pandemic, life as we knew it was turned upside down. Like I am responsible for overseeing the provision of a lot of different services. And we had to go from working, out of 4 offices to working virtually overnight. And, fortunately, we had the infrastructure and the technology that we were able to serve our clients. But it was really difficult. It was really difficult. And so when we left on March 13th, we thought we were going to be out a couple of weeks. We didn't think we were going to be out a few years. And also how we got our food, just the world as we knew it was turned upside down. And so our brain has to work on overdrive to compensate for that lack of certainty. And then I think after watching George Floyd being murdered and the whole reckoning that happened afterwards, again, we learned that history that we were taught was not accurate. And there was a whole nother way our brains had to make sense of a whole new bit of information. So what the world asked of us over the last few years is significantly greater than what it normally asks of us to do.
These are great points. And Janice, just to build on that, how do you tackle compassion fatigue through adoptions together?
Yeah, so it's such a good question because we really deal with it on lots of different levels. One, we deal with it with the families that we serve, many who are really struggling as their children find their way in the world. We deal with it with our staff who are wrapping around to support those families. And so I'm going to start with staff because you can't give to someone else that which you don't possess yourself. And so if my staff are exhausted and they they don't have the right support, it's very hard for them to then support the families. So, one of the things that I think about all the time is that as human beings, we're wired for relationship. Or biologically, we are wired to be in relationship. With when we're born, we don't have the resources to care for ourselves. So if there's not a caregiver, we will literally die. We can't feed ourselves, we can't care for ourselves, and our brain develops in response to other people. So human connection is at the core of all the work we do. So the first thing, I think about as a leader, I think about something called neuro leadership, which is understanding the brain in the context of how we come to work every day, and what does the system look like at work. So really what that means is really helping to identify the drivers. We talk about the drivers of social engagement, and then how to strengthen that. So there's somebody I love studying with, Dr. David Rock from the Neuro Leadership Institute. He talks about something called the SCARF model, which talks about status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. Each is 5 different social drivers that we have in the workplace. So as an organization, we really focus on each of these drivers and help to make sure that from a status perspective that we're really seeing our staff, we're listening to them. The certainty piece is knowing what's going to happen next. The autonomy is being able to work independently and feel respected. The relatedness is being in relationship. And then the fairness is people being treated similarly. We've redone so many of our policies and ways of practicing since over the last 3 years. Everything from our leave policies to everybody working hybrid or virtually, to how we do our performance evaluations to make it much more based on engagement, because we know that engagement and being seen is going to be a remedy for burnout and compassion fatigue. We know that when people are heard and that they're seen, that they are going to be much more engaged. So we've looked at our personnel policies, how we nurture our staff. We were able to change some of our salaries, some of our benefits, and structure in time for people to take care of themselves, to be nurtured and held. So it's been very intentional. We've been doing a full study. We've been working with a group called Ideas Generation, where we're talking about inclusivity, diversity, equity, and
it really sounds like you all have done a deep dive and a lot of lessons learned.
So many. And we take it really seriously because we know the cost if we don't take it seriously. The cost,
absolutely.
we see it everywhere.
And that's a fantastic segue to Tamar. What are some of the signs of compassion fatigue, speaking of those costs, that you see in your practice and also in your research?
So first, I'll say it cuts across all levels. It's individual, it's organizational, but it also impacts our patients. And on individual level, I'll honestly say that I didn't know what it was until frustration led to figuring it out long after it happened, but a feeling that you needed to remove yourself from this. So I worked as a trauma nurse, and it is that repeated exposure that just retrospectively, I can assign that terminology to it. So I think the initial part is at least acknowledging that you are exposed to it and identifying the individuals who are at increased risk. So healthcare, education. As a nurse, I'm acutely aware of the repeated exposure that I have, because we see individuals on mostly their worst days. And most of those are going to be traumatic days for them. Specific to my research, I wanted to just share 2 pieces. The first part is a recent research we did with nurses to have them share what is their experience of trauma and what are their coping mechanisms. And it's in this piece that we saw where, although not naming it, it describes specifically compassion fatigue and to some extent eventually burnout. And alarmingly, it's a coping mechanism that they were using to cope with this feeling, and that heavily relied on substances. Some of them were just named substances, but there were very specific references to alcohol, and sadly, some of them considering leaving the profession, but also not seeking help internally with the other individuals that are experiencing it, but externally to individuals who might not understand. Which raises a host of other questions as to who is responsible for taking care of, which I hope we can get to later in our discussion. But the other piece is the long-term effects of repeated exposure to trauma biologically. And so some of my research looks specifically at trauma. Mine is specifically traumatic brain injury, but trauma can be experienced in multiple ways. And one of the ongoing theories is that there is a biological change that happens that can lead to other mental health disorders, which can then increases your comorbidity. So while it's something that we have an opportunity to correct, we also need to correct it quickly because the long-lasting implication can be detrimental to the individual, their families as a byproduct, but can also lead to the patients that they're wanting to take care of being negatively impacted, and ultimately the organization in which they're trying to do their work.
Great point. And Dr. Anderson, I think that leads into another really salient question. Speaking of the vulnerability that comes along with cumulative exposure, and that's our children. And so what are some of the changes you've seen in the education system and in school-age children that seem to be expressing or exhibiting these symptoms of fatigue?
Well, I will say that I think that we are experiencing stress in our schools across the board. So whether you're talking about the physical building, the campus, or you're talking about the staff, or you're talking about the students, I think that everyone is experiencing a stress. First of all, we closed schools, as Dr. Goldwater said, we closed schools on March 13th with the intention that this was a 2-week hiatus. And then it really stretched out into almost 2 years of our students being at home. And so that shift was a stress because we had to now convert the majority of America's school children, in our public schools at least, into online students, online learners. The teachers had never been trained in that. The students had never been trained in that. We didn't have the capacity for all of the technology needs that needed to be distributed. So on a dime, we expected everybody to quickly adapt to this because of what the pandemic demanded. That was a stress, right? Likewise, we had a stress when it was time to go back to school. So now everybody has to have masks. People have to have vaccines. We've changed what it looks like to be in a public school. That was stressful for our students, for parents who are trying to keep their children safe. When, we're trying to count COVID cases in our schools, we're trying to be good stewards of our children's health, but all of that changed overnight. Like Dr. Rodney said, after you're running on empty for so long, it does begin to change some of the biological markers. And so people were experiencing that stress from having been exposed to that repeatedly. So the people who most often have to experience that are our school administrators, who we turned into basically public health workers, because now they're administering COVID tests, right? They're trying to make sure that the classrooms are safe. And so they didn't sign up for that when they decided they wanted to be a school leader. That's a challenge, right? Then you also have your classroom teachers who are also trying to figure out how to keep social distancing safe in their classrooms, as well as being instructional sages on the stage. So that was another stress. So we've got all of these things happening between just the physical campus, trying to make sure that that's a safe space, and our school leaders and our school teachers. Then you add on the layer of the young people that the schools are intended to serve, right? Our students. And so they have experienced trauma in many cases because of all of these changes that have been wrought in their lives over a very short period of time. We had students that missed their proms, students that missed their graduations. We had to reconfigure classes. Some students went from one type of learning setting to a different type of learning setting. We know that chronic absenteeism has been a huge issue in the return to schools. We know that suicide ideation amongst girls in particular has increased twice the rate that it was before the pandemic. So we're seeing a lot of this stress manifest in our young people. And so we've got stressed out adults who are exhausted. You've got parents who are stressed out, they're exhausted. The young people are exhibiting some of these same kinds of traumas because they're also having suicidal ideation, and climate concerns in schools have gone way through the roof, right? So we're seeing, and you see it all the time because we're seeing all these climate concerns. And now I'll add on this other layer around the safe and healthy piece, which is that we are on track right now to be ahead of where we were last year. Last year, we had 93 school shootings, and we're already at 89. And so we have really put ourselves in a position where, because we rushed to get everything back to normal, go back to school, we didn't really understand that what we unpacked, we couldn't just put it back in the box. Pandora's box is open. And so now we've got people who are really showing how their stress has just led them to make poor choices over and over again. And we have not, as a collective, quite figured out how we slow this moving train down. But make no mistake, everybody's exhausted. The people in the building are exhausted. The leaders in the building are exhausted. Our young people are exhausted. We never took a break once the pandemic happened because we were so consumed with the idea that we get back to normal instead of really understanding what the new normal is. And that is why everybody is exhausted.
That if I could stand up and shout, I would absolutely. And we're seeing that not only in our schools, but in every single industry. I want to come back to a couple of things that the group has said here. What struck me that what you were saying, Dr. Anderson, was this talked about this forced adaptation. We know human beings do not like change. We like routine. We like the way we know, but the pandemic really forced an adaptation. And once forced into that adaptation, we were not going to be forced into any further adaptations. We want either A or B that we know. We don't care that it's purple. And then Dr. Rodney, you also, and Dr. Goldwater, you alluded to this as well, that compassion fatigue can be a continuum that ends in burnout. Did I understand that correctly? Are there some other pieces associated with that? Looking at this just exhaustion. And, you know, to your point that looking at those children once again running out of that school in Nashville, you know, it just is like, no more. What more can we be expected to have? So, you know, is it just, could somebody help me unpack that continuum a little bit? And then what are we facing with burnout?
I can try and tackle it. So if we take it on a continuum, compassion fatigue is supposed to have a quicker recovery time when compared to burnout. So burnout being the end part of it. I did some fascinating work with a student in Lebanon who tried to find that middle ground, and the middle ground termed brownout, as in the color brownout. It's an engineering term, and if we put it into realistic context, it's like a light bulb. When it's about to go out, it flickers. So it gives you the warning shot. So it's giving us a signal to say we need to do something. And at that middle ground, there's still time for repair. We can remove the individual from that situation, identify that this is happening, but before we lose our individuals, before we have those fatal errors, or we lose a child to doing something which is a cause of stress, we lose a healthcare worker to the profession permanently. We have an opportunity to do something, and we need to start identifying it. Quite frankly, burnout is still a very, very far way in to identify, but at least it gives us an opportunity before an individual's reached complete burnout, as a complete exhaustion, to make a change and to help that individual. What is less defined here is who is supposed to make that change, who is responsible, because it's very difficult at this point. One, the individual while you're going through this may not be able to put words or context to what is happening to them, because in the state of fatigue, I'm not sure about you, but I can't think straight. And if you're in a state of compassion fatigue, I can't expect that individual to be able to make the decisions or verbalize into words or admit that this is the state that they're in. And then if they're within a system, an organization, a school, a clinic, a hospital, should there be a responsibility in the organization to look for those signs, but not just look for them, but to assist that individual so you can preserve them as a human being and remove some of those barriers that they're facing?
Oh, that's incredibly helpful. So from that lens, is quiet quitting a version of brownout?
It's a tough one because going back to my research, what we did, I don't know if it's quiet quitting because we saw the signs coming. We did see they might make up excuses to go, but I think those excuses that they were giving is also the brake light, do something. So they might fade into being absent or want extra time off or extend their vacation time. But I also think they're saying, I care about this profession and I'm asking you to help me. And in the interim, these are some of the things that I'm doing. The individuals we're talking about who are exposed to trauma are our nurses and our teachers and our healthcare workers and our social workers who care. This is a chosen profession with multiple certification that goes into it. So this is not an accidental career. So these are individuals with a different level of care, and it is that care that has gotten us into compassion fatigue. So I find it very hard sometimes to even accept the term about quiet quitting, because I don't think any of those individuals go quietly, but there is a point where they might be forced to go because they have experienced burnout because they have not received the help they were supposed to get.
And if I could just jump into what Dr. Rodney has just said, I think that we see quiet quitting in education because we've got such a significant teacher shortage and it's not getting better, right? We've got districts that are trying to hire thousands of teachers in the next iteration of their hiring process. And so we're really going to be in a pickle because you've got districts that are trying to hold on to their administrators, hoping that the administrators don't start moving from district to district or out the door into a new profession. And likewise, we are also seeing this with the massive shortages that we have already in so many of our districts. And so what is also ironic is that the students who need the most experienced teachers, the students who need the teachers who have the most energy to help to fix this situation are the very ones that are not coming into our schools and districts. And so we are headed for a little bit of a crunch if we don't get ahead of this. And so we know that we've had a significant drop in the number of people who are in our teacher preparation programs across the country. And so it suggests that the quiet quitting that you mentioned has happened. It's been coming for a while, so it's not a surprise. It just happened that all of these things were coming at the same time. So the pandemic, in a way, created a perfect storm situation, right? And so now we've got to figure out, how do we get out of this while we retain and encourage the people who are not quitting to get rejuvenated so that they can resolve any compassion fatigue that they might have.
That's a really good point. Oh, but I had a question for you, Janice, to build on this. So build away. We're talking about the adults primarily. Our young people, were absolutely seeing those stressors, but our children and our families are at crucial points in their lives during this 3-year period where everyone around them is getting exhausted. What are we're beginning to see some of those second and third order consequences. What are some of the things you're seeing with families and these children that are social developmental second and third order consequences.
Mhm. I mean, I think Dr. Anderson said it really beautifully, what she's seeing in schools. I mean, that's what we're seeing through our counseling programs and family support services. Exhausted parents, traumatized parents, exhausted children, traumatized children, school. When my children went to school, which is not that long ago, I didn't worry that they were going to get shot. I can't imagine sending my children to school worrying every day that they're going to get shot, or sitting in a classroom wondering if it's going to happen. There's so many different layers, and the amount that we're seeing, the amount of anxiety, again, the suicidology, the significant increase. Behaviors are bigger. There's more shutdown. So on the lower end, more kids are shutting down, and we're seeing on the higher end more explosive and outrageous behaviors. The severity of the behavioral manifestations of this upset are just way bigger than we've seen before. So, I mean, I think that, everything from how technologies in our lives, that we became even more dependent on our technology. And there's so much that happens from a parent to a child when we just make eye contact and we're sitting together and we're talking. And then it's so easy to have our technology. And so, I mean, I just think that there's so many different pieces. One of the things that I would say is that the psychoed piece, the having information, the more information that parents can have, that teachers can have, and we have the same problem in the social work field, the child welfare field, of a significant decrease in a number of open positions and people leaving the child welfare field. I think the more we can normalize what's going on, we can, as leaders, intentionally address it. We can teach people to be aware of the symptoms, to notice and name, to not judge it, but to say, this is normal. Parents, this is normal to feel this way. And then what can we do about it? What can we do about it? How can we work together? We also see services being delivered very differently than they once were. One of the things that we've seen is that our support groups are much more, our virtual support groups are significantly higher. There's significant higher attendance of people coming to virtual support groups than we had in the in-person groups prior to the pandemic. So it's really thinking, like, how do we deliver services? How do we connect? How do we work in a way that our kids can be seen, and that our parents, when they see these pretty extreme and scary behaviors, that they can understand and they can figure out what might be, how can I stay curious of what's behind this behavior as compared to the things that we as parents often say about our children when we see such extreme behaviors.
And Catherine, if I can because I want to jump in, something that Dr. Goldwater just said really prompted me to remember too, that for parents, they're also dealing with this in a political context that has been very different than most other political cycles, right? So you layer the pandemic on top of, well, now we're dealing with inflation. We were dealing with January 6th, the contested election. And the fact that it used to be that when people didn't agree politically, they still had respect for each other across the aisle. Now, what we're seeing is, if you don't agree with me politically, you're a bad person. And I only want to be with the other good people who are like me. And so that has contributed to the stress of parents, because we have typically been raised to teach our children to have manners and to be polite. But we are now in a political context where it's winner take all. So, and so I think that what we're also seeing is that parents are often also struggling with how to break all of this down to their children in this context. So for them, just turning on the news is another way to become triggered by this exhaustion. And so there's this just unending cacophony of things that are pushing everybody into this cycle of endless fatigue.
One tiny piece to add, it's a prompting of ideas here. So I work with parents as well, but parents who are in treatment program. And one of the most difficult things I had to witness is parents who most of them don't yet have a GED, who are giving multiple roles now. They're now safety officers, they are parents, they are the internet guiders, and they're educational evaluators, and they feel inadequate and sometimes too ashamed to say so. Even in a well-educated parent, find it really hard to remember what trigonometry is. And sometimes that gets lost because the last couple years have pushed parents into a new role which they're not always prepared for, and that creates so much frustration. The one enduring thing is the access to additional resources, and to use that frustration of caring and to draw that little line to normalize it, to say, guess what? It's you, me, and everybody who is going through this now, but the focus has to be less on what you know as a educated or not educated parent, and recognize that at some level, everybody is experiencing a version of this. So I do like that idea of normalizing it as much as possible, and to be less critical of ourselves, which can lessen some of that feeling of fatigue.
No, well said. Just for everyone who is with us virtually, please keep those questions coming, put them in the chat. We'll get to them shortly. I have had a couple of questions triggered by this really rich discussion we're having. Is something you brought up, Dr. Goldwater, and you as well, Dr. Anderson. We have a generation of children who have been taught how to hide in classrooms because they are getting a repeated message and a repeated reinforcement that they are not safe in schools. They may not come home from school one day because they've been shot or one of their friends have been shot. How does this constant threat of trauma feed into compassion fatigue, not only for these young people, but for their families?
Well, I'll start, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Goldwater. The other end of this extreme is, Dr. Ling, we're not just thinking about the fact that our young people are being exposed to the possibility of school shootings. It's also that this is itself a continuum, that we are policing students' bodies, that we now have armed guards in our schools. You know, our generation did not go to school with school resource officers. We did not have, the police in our schools. And so we have shifted what it means to be safe and healthy. We didn't have weapons detection systems. We weren't buying equipment for facial recognition software in our schools when we were in schools. And so as parents, we don't quite know how our young people feel because we did not go through that same experience, right? And so that adds a layer of stress to what our young people are experiencing, right? And so I think that, this just makes it much more likely that our young people are going to stuff it down. They're going to be stressed. We have seen the trauma that Alice drills have caused for some young students because they're being confronted in first and second grade with the possibility that there could be a shooter in their school. And it's made real by what we saw in Uvalde, Texas, where the police delayed entry. And so parents are also stressed about that because now they're dropping their children off and they don't know that the helpers are going to be available to help save the children. So all of this has just continued to raise this level of anxiety. And so parents have a lot of stress. And so when their children come to them with questions about this, I think that it really does beg the question around whether we have equipped our parents to help their young people to unpack some of the responses to questions that we ourselves don't fully have the answers to yet.
No, that's brilliantly said. Go ahead.
One of the things that I always think about is like what's behind the behavior. And one of the things that we know is that there's a part of our brain, in our midbrain, we have something called our amygdala that is always looking in the environment, scanning the environment for danger. It's a survival part of the brain. And so when it smells smoke or feels something that's dangerous, it sets off an alarm and it actually takes over our thinking. So every time that happens, our brain gets, we have more, that gets more sensitive and responsive. When our midbrain or our amygdala is firing like that, it's really hard to think. You can't have your midbrain telling you danger, 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 and solve a math problem at the same time, or even have a thoughtful conversation. And so what we're seeing is I bet we're going to see more kids that get diagnosed with ADD and ADHD and other kinds of attentional issues because their nervous system is on fire from being scared. And it's, we've got to find ways to slow down and really think about their nervous systems and how to create an environment, and for the teacher too. And I worked at a mental health center where one of my colleagues was shot. That was back in the 80s. And, back then we didn't talk about trauma, and the supervisor said, any of these social workers who can't handle it can go home early today. And it was like the next year I sat, I switched where my seat was, and every time someone moved, my heart beat sped up. It's like, were they going to get a gun? As compared to really doing some trauma therapeutic work, there's so many good treatments out there now to get the trauma out of our bodies, to release it, to make sense of it, to integrate it, and get rid of it. And so just having that available to the community so we can slow people's nervous systems down is just, I think, really critical.
That is a fantastic point. And we have some questions that have already come into the chat. I'm going to go ahead and bring these forward. First one is, do you think that mental health is going to only worsen from here?
I can take it. So there's a sad portion to this because we now recognize how extensive mental health issues are. But there's also been an opportunity with this crisis for individuals to feel more okay to say, I am not okay. And because there's so many individuals who are willing to say that and not be criticized, or it's still happening to some degree. So let's not get too carried away here. But I do think that there has been a positive push towards, let us take better care of our mental health issues. It is bad. And I really think that point about, they're constantly on alert, that does something to the body. You don't need a genetic code breaking to understand that an individual's body is not meant to be in constant fear overdrive all the time. What I'm worried about is that we won't see that true outcome for a while, and it will be masked as behaviors, bad behaviors, which will exacerbate into more adulthood mental health problems. It also gives us an opportunity, though, to say, let's give some more policy changes to how we treat mental health disorder. Let's get more support to educate more mental health providers. Let's pay them better. Let's make more changes, structural changes. Some of it we're waiting to see. We're waiting to see. The stigma still exists. We're waiting to name it. One of the suggestions was that there should be a specific PTSD criteria for a pandemic. There should be one around the media because specifics around those don't change. So what I'm hoping is that this positive outlook on taking care of ourselves, naming and taking care of mental health issues, and prioritizing wellness will be the way we go forward. And then the research field, the individuals who hold the purse will continue to support strategies, policies, and financial initiatives to take care of mental health before it becomes so problematic. But fully expect that there's a lot of it that we don't know the full effect yet.
Really great point. Here's a really interesting question. Is rest a luxury? And I would say, is rest and the capacity to take as needed rest and self-care a social determinant of health?
I think we know that rest is essential, especially for the development of young children's brains as well as their physical bodies. So we can't make rest be a luxury. Everyone needs rest. I think what you're starting to see in some pockets, we've seen workforces go to 4-day work weeks. We've seen that people are still pushing to work remotely because it's a mental health issue for some people now to be in the actual office 4 days, 5 days a week. And so people are learning to create boundaries where they can be able to take care of themselves. And rest is one of those key barometers of how you heal from compassion fatigue. So it's not a luxury, it's just self-care.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%, 100%. And it used to be that you just worked more. Like that was how we were taught, in my generation, like just work harder, just work more. And it was almost a badge of success if you worked all the time. And gosh, today we know that was not accurate. All we're doing is burning out our brains, exhausting ourselves. In fact, creativity diminishes when we work too hard and too long and exhaust our brains. And now that we've got some good science, we've got the data that tells us we need rest. We need rest.
Can I just be devil's advocate here? Socially, rest is still seen as a luxury item. And just conceptually, for say we're going on vacation, I'm going to get some more rest. Like, who can afford to go on vacation, first of all? And why is it seen as a thing? It should be normalized to say, taking time to rest from my work should be a thing that you are encouraged to do, as opposed to glamorized as an event. In terms of it being considered a social determinant of health, I think it should be singled out. Individuals who are living in neighborhoods where it's a norm for drug trafficking to start at 4 a.m. means that they're going to be disturbed from their sleep at 4 a.m. comparative to individuals who are in quieter neighborhoods who can rest in until 9 under soundproof doors, don't have that disturbance, wanted or unwanted. So we're not willing to quite name it yet. We know the data exists, but the reality is that we continuously put terminology around individuals choosing to take a break as something that is fabulous, fantastic. Oh, I hope you're going off to somewhere nice and warm, as opposed to wonderful, good for you. I'm doing that next month too, as something that is encouraged, as opposed to it's a glamorous part of what we do. And what my usual response is, rest, what is that? Which is something that I've tried not to do or say, because that further perpetuates this idea that we don't do it, or we don't deserve it, or it's not something we should aim for as a normal part of our workday.
And the value. We value work. We don't attach value to rest. How many people have said, okay, I'm going to be out of the office, but you can reach me on my cell phone?
Well, and the other piece is that so many of us are part of the sandwich generation. So we are taking care of our families. We're also taking care of our spouses. We're potentially taking care of parents. We're taking care of our careers. We're taking care of so many different things. And so without rest, without the capacity to be able to recharge and refuel, you're not doing any of those things well. But there's so many competing demands in society that are placed on us. And let me say in particular, women, we don't do very well with saying that we need a break, because we know that so much is expected of us that we just feel like it's part of our job to tunnel through, that we'll get up earlier, we'll go to bed later, because we've got to do all the things, especially those of us who have careers. And so it becomes really challenging, right, to say that we're going to take that vacation, as Dr. Rodney says, because not so much because we don't want to have one, but because we don't have time, because we're so busy taking care of all the things.
Dr. Anderson, thank you for saying that. And I'm so sorry, I just need to jump in on this one, because we frequently admit this, that women in particular, structurally, the environment, the social environment, the work environment is not designed for women to be successful in multiple roles. It's still considered a thing that you are a working mother. Why is there such a title? Why is it that structurally the burden of care still falls on the parent, who is the mother, who is the woman? That still exists. And that's because we're not too far removed from expectation of what women, mothers, wives are expected to do, and the choice to do something else, like choose a career, means that you will need to work harder, rest less, and care for yourself less. And so that structurally still exists, but it's something that is frequently overlooked, with expectations and demands to be successful still remaining the same. But frequently unacknowledged, or we're not even close to that being normalized. So thank you for raising that, because as we talk about compassion fatigue, one of the reasons that it exists is because it's competing roles that we're trying to balance.
Really great point. Here's another question from the chat. As a natural giver, I have seen the extremes of both positive and negative of compassion fatigue and giving. One of the most impactful but elementary books I had to refer back to was The Giving Tree by Shel Silverstein. What boundaries can we teach our children and close community and family to take better care of ourselves? So that felt, I don't know who put that in. That's a fantastic question, and it really follows beautifully on the thread of the discussion here.
Dr. Goldwater?
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, it's really important to teach your children how to take care of themselves. I think the pandemic, if it taught me nothing else as a mother, I learned how to tell my children, let's go take a walk. Let's go do something active, because I think that there were so many frustrating situations, and especially in the beginning with the technology and the school and all that. And, I'm trying to transition to working from home and all those. So I'm feeling stressed. The kids are feeling stressed. You don't know what to do. And everybody's, yelling at each other because we don't know how to take care of ourselves first. And so, that image of the oxygen mask dropping and you putting it on yourself as a mom, to Dr. Rodney's point, and then being able to share it with others so that you can take care of them. I had to tell my own kids, okay, so let's do this, let's do that. But it really was me being intentional about how I was going to take care of myself first, because it with us, with women too, the other piece I'll say is that we see it not only in the lack of rest, but in our diets, our lack of exercise, right? So we see it in our blood pressure, we see it in diabetes, we see it in all of these comorbidities that crop up because high cholesterol, because we weather this in our bodies. And so it's really important to teach your children how to take care of themselves first, so that they can be good to have compassion for other people. That's an important strategy.
One of the gifts of mindfulness and yoga and other kinds of body work, and bringing that into the schools, is that we can teach children how to breathe in a way that's going to calm themselves down, how to identify when they have tension in their bodies, how to realize when they're having thoughts that are flying through. And I think there's just the emergence of that whole approach for working with kids is incredibly helpful. Because often, like with that, there was like when there's when one has a huge feeling or a huge something, they just wonder what's wrong with me. And even the question is like, is everybody's mental health just going, is it just getting awful? People are having bigger feelings, and people are resilient, and we can tap our resiliency, we can heal. And if we intentionally have environments that can help us, it's not a lost cause. It's not a lost cause. And I think just the whole mindfulness, yoga, body-centered, somatic, that whole school of thought is just, in practice, it was hugely important for teaching children self-regulation and understanding their bodies.
I think that's a really key point. Can you three just unpack what you mean by resiliency and how that differs from toxic positivity? Just we've got some really great questions coming up here, but I think if we just take this moment to clarify, that's really gonna to help our intentions with the rest of the question.
Toxic positivity is, you got this, but something difficult happens, not acknowledging that something difficult happened, that everything, it's going to get better. It's okay. This too shall pass, as compared to when something difficult happens, looking somebody in the eye and saying, oh my goodness, this must be so hard. This must be so hard. I'm sorry that you're going through this right now. And acknowledging it, notice and naming the pain, and normalizing the pain, having people be seen. Afterwards, if you want to get into this, it's going to be so nice when this too shall pass. I mean, I'm one of those people who I always find the silver lining. I mean, I've had some adversity in my life and I have grown and I've always learned from it. And so when I first started studying positive toxicity, toxic positivity, I was like, what do you mean? Like, I need to have affirming things around me all the time. And there's so many things. But what I was not thinking about was the invalidation that can happen when we just go straight to that affirming statement without acknowledging. And the more we don't acknowledge when someone's in pain, the more they stuff it down, because secrets go deeper and deeper and deeper. And that's another way that we get compassion fatigue, is when we're holding on to too much. We've got to be able to just let it go.
Let it go. What is sort of my favorite song that I sing every morning, to let it go.
Let it go.
And thank you for saying this about the invalidation part for toxic positivity. And if I could just share resilience, the way I see it is a beautiful tree I saw. I grew up in a hurricane Caribbean country, which is surprisingly something that I remember with really good memories, because fruits would fall. But in one of those hurricanes, one of our coconut tree fell. But that coconut tree, it's like half out of the root and it grew with a bend, but it still bore fruit. And it's years after I thought about, that's how I want to remember someone being resilient. And that's how I describe it to my patients, to say something negative can happen, something bad can happen, but that doesn't mean that even with the scar that remain, or the trace of something bad happening remaining, that you still can't be fruitful. And because that coconut tree still bare, and gladly, because it had a bend, it was low enough so I could access. And so that accessibility around you being able to see something from a different perspective, still bloom and thrive in spite of, regardless, even with, is something you can still be proud of, instead of being shamed into not feeling positive, is one of the better ways that I've tried to remember that regardless, even that coconut tree been through Hurricane Gilbert, it will still bear fruit, and it's low enough for tomorrow to pick. So others can still benefit from you as a whole person, even with a scar of bad things from the past.
I will never hear resilience and not think of your
No, I
visual.
love it. Love it. Love it. Love it.
That's fantastic. The next question is, why the uptick of violence, though? Dr. Anderson mentioned the rise of shootings this year,
Yep.
for one, and we're only 3 months in. I mean, this might have been the longest march in history, but it's still March. I don't remember it being this bad even 5 years ago. Is it because these are getting more publicized, or is the climate changing and people are hurting more than ever before?
So I think that's an amazing question. And I actually think it's a confluence of several factors that make it, again, a perfect storm. Number one, this country refuses, to my great frustration, to look at this issue around changing gun policy. We know that in most of these shootings, that an AR-15 was the weapon of choice. And yet we as a country, we talk about gun policy, we talk about gun violence, but instead of really tackling the issue at its core, we keep trying to say, well, it's mental health issues. Well, they have mental health issues in other countries, but they've also tackled this gun violence issue by changing gun laws so that there's not as much easy access to guns as we have in this country. The shooter in this week's Nashville shooting had seven weapons, and her family didn't know that she had any of them. They knew she had one, but they thought that she had sold that one. So what you're seeing is that there's such an easy legal access to weapons that we're not ready to deal with, that makes it very easy for people who want to use weapons as a way to express their frustration. They can have easy access to that. The other issue, quite honestly, is that we are seeing a rise in the amount of people who need more conflict resolution training. So we have come out of this pandemic. The Biden administration has put so much money into ARPA funds so that we can get more social workers and school counselors and school psychologists into our schools. But we really need to focus on helping our students with conflict resolution. Personally, I also think that there's another layer to this, which is that the pandemic halted the developmental growth of our young people in some ways, right? So they missed about 2 years of developmental practice that they need in terms of socialization. And now they've come back into their schools chronologically older, but I think emotionally and socially and psychologically, there's a little bit of a delay. And so they're going straight to the worst solution instead of trying to think about what are some other mediating steps that I can take to help to unpack some of this conflict that I'm seeing. So we're hearing violence happen at younger ages. You saw in Virginia where the young person in the first grade class shot his teacher, brought a gun and shot the teacher. So these are not isolated incidents. This continues to happen because our young people need to have other strategies. They go straight to the violence. And so if we as the adults are not looking at intervening and helping our young people see that there are many, many choices that they could choose besides violence, I have to say this, it really worries me that on social media, in my feed, I keep seeing these videos of people fighting, people having conflicts with each other, people yelling, calling each other names. So when our kids see that, right, we were not generationally exposed to that because we didn't have cell phones like this. We didn't have the constant barrage of images, constant barrage of messages that our young people are exposed to. And so we don't know what the long-term consequence is of having our young people exposed to social media at such a young age. We're seeing so many of our young people that are talking about doing things on social media, and then it spills over into the schools. That's what's happening. A lot of this is starting on social media and it's spilling over into the schools. Teachers don't know anything about it. The administrators don't know anything about it. They're trying to get ahead of it, but it's very difficult to stay on top of this. So I would just say that I think that we're really between a rock and a hard place because it's a perfect storm of events all cascading at one time. We could fix this, but it takes our country having the courage to stand up to the gun lobby and saying we need to do better for the next generation of our kids because they have been impacted by this pandemic. We're seeing it. It's playing out every day. We see it on the news, and yet we keep sending thoughts and prayers that are empty and vacuous and not fixing the real problem.
Well said. Next, as a fatigued parent, the point Dr. Campbell Anderson made is extremely relevant. I struggle with navigating the social political dynamics that bombard my 3 children. Are there social services available to parents when they reach the burned out stage that Dr. Rodney mentioned? And I would add to that, recognizing the brownout, do we have to reach burnout before we activate services or go searching for them?
There's a whole continuum of services and support out within the community. And I'm wondering if, if we had some kind of a resource list we could share with people who, after this Facebook Live is completed. I know we have people from all over the place, so it's a little bit challenging geographically, but through public agencies, through the Department of Behavioral Health, there would be all kinds of programs. So people look at their state directory through possibly like through the Department of Behavioral Health, Also, going online and Googling support for parents. There's so many rich resources out there. At my organization, we have 3 parent support groups for adoptive parents statewide in Maryland. And many other organizations have services that are without any cost or that are very affordable that are available for parents. If you're having that feeling like this feels like too much, take it seriously. Take it seriously. Get yourself some help. Get yourself some help. Because like we've said, if we don't take care of ourselves, how are we going to take care of somebody else? We can't give to somebody else that which we don't have ourselves. And the world is asking so much of us as parents, so much of us as professionals, so much of us as community members. And taking care of children is so much psychological, physical, and everything work. It's hard. So parents, we have to take care of ourselves. We have to take care of ourselves.
Well said. We've got a series of really lovely comments I want to make sure that I share with everyone. So sadly, parents cannot completely relate to the experiences that our children are having at school with regards to safety, drills, and the possibility of a traumatic episode. It feels like an attempt to limit our natural responsibility to be overly compassionate at a detriment to ourselves. A very excellent point. And then thank you, Dr. Goldwater, for the notion that there are therapies to help release trauma and calm the nervous system. Where can they be found?
Services can be found really throughout the community. If people would like to reach out to me to see about finding some resources in the community, my email is jgoldwater@adoptionstogether.org. Or I wonder if through the HEAT program, if there's some resources. So, I can share everything that I know and try to connect people. Services are out there. They're in rural areas, they're in urban areas. It's just a matter of getting connected to them. And also there's so much that is available online and through our YMCAs, through our churches, through some of our schools. So it's again, I'm happy to answer any questions or try to connect people if they want to reach out.
Thank you. A couple of comments here about very good points about about the responsibility of women taking care of it versus rest. And thank you for recognizing this. Women are expected to do it all, and nothing short of it all will do. And I think at every stage of life, there is some piece of that. Another comment, I fully agree with Dr. Rodney that rest should be a natural part of a health continuum for individuals and not defined culturally as a luxury. We should advocate for rest across our culture. I absolutely agree with that. And here's another question. Does toxic positivity exacerbate exhaustion and fatigue? And do we need to feel happy all the time?
Yes, it exacerbates it. Yes, because it's intimidating. And if I feel really lousy, and it's not okay to feel really lousy. I remember one time on a really hard day, somebody who was once a friend said, "You made your bed, now you have to live with it." All I wanted was someone just to say, "Oh, I'm sorry, this must be so difficult." Yes, if when the world gives you that message, it definitely makes it worse, and it's exhausting to shove it down. Exhausting. We need to be able to acknowledge when something hurts, and we don't have to feel cheerful every day. We don't have to feel, because sometimes life is difficult and we don't feel good, and it's okay.
As it relates to patience and conflict resolution, you brought up how we need to teach conflict resolution to our kids. But how do we address conflict resolution in a healthy manner amongst adults? This is an excellent question. I think that might be the $6 million question, to be honest. And how do, when you see behaviors that are just abhorrent
Yes.
in public by adults, what is our role, especially when young people are watching?
Well, because you get likes for being impolite, right? When those messages go out over social media, everybody's doing everything to be liked, like me, give me attention, give me attention. And so it does create this really like a conundrum, because bad behaviors are being reinforced with likes, right? And so that's the issue, that we have to try to countermand these bad behaviors, but people are getting lots of toxically positive reinforcement for doing these kinds of negative behavior, for enacting negative behaviors. So I think that's the challenge. When we live in a culture that thrives on likes, please like me, drop me a like. Everything is about the likes. And so that is what makes this across social media, it's such a profound phenomenon that we have not really fully understood. I think that it's a challenge for us to say, well, this is how we think that adults should handle these situations, because you don't necessarily get liked for doing the things that are going to get people saying, oh, that was nice. You get liked for doing things that are dramatic, that draw attention, that get people riled up. And so that's the world that we live in. We live in a world where things are done for likes. And that is dangerous, because that's a shift that in our culture. It's also a shift in why we're so tired, because we're spending all of our time trying to be liked.
And then the other thing is when we have political leaders who are bullies and who demonstrate such disrespect for fellow human beings, and get, people still follow them, they still support them. And so it's almost like all the things that we're teaching our kids about how to treat people are then being demonstrated for us by people who are in leadership. And so I think it's so confusing, so confusing. Again, I always come back to the nervous system, because the only person that any of us can control is ourselves. The only body we can control is our own. So the more we can slow our own selves down so we can show up in as thoughtful as a way possible, because we're well enough taken care of, the better the chance are that we'll be able to show up in a positive way in the world.
Catherine, there's a comment you made which has stuck with me, and I am hoping to just get 30 seconds to address it. To the parent who said they can't necessarily relate to the environment where the children are going, and they're being taught active shooter training. I just want to say, as a parent to a parent, no, you can't. But there is a space that you preserve for love and care and safety when they get home, and you get to still teach them principles about how it can be. That is still extremely valuable, and that remains the anchor. The home, the space in the home, the role as a parent still remains the anchor, and regardless of the differences in the school environment and the things that they have to teach them, sadly, they might need, and we've seen too many times that students might need it, still remains valuable. So don't despair is what I'll say, and still preserve that role as a parent and the home as a safe place, and continue to teach that, and accepting that some of the teachings in the classroom are also necessary. God forbid we need it, but we still have some control over what happens inside the home.
And just to follow up to that, if I may, I had a situation where I have 3 teenagers, and one of my teenagers was catfished, right? So this situation went on for several days. I was not aware of it, because all of this, again, it's happening in these phones. It's happening on social media. So I don't know until my teenager finally breaks down, because they had been given all this money away, because they were now caught in this situation. And so I had to finally say, there's nothing more important to your father and I than you. And that you can always, no matter what, you can always come and tell us because we are here. So to Dr. Rodney's point, I think that for many parents, we don't know what our young people are experiencing on a day-to-day basis because they're also not telling us how they are interacting and intersecting necessarily with these devices. And so I think it's really important to Dr. Rodney's point that you set these these foundational expectations that in the home, you can share. In our home, you can tell us anything because if your young people can tell you things, that's where we're going to get to the root of our young people who are feeling suicidal or feeling overwhelmed, feeling stressed. And so even though you may have compassion fatigue as a parent, you're still going to make sure your kid is okay. We have also seen an explosive rise in the number of young people who are ODing on fentanyl in our schools. That and vaping, right? So we've seen that our young people are taking their stress out in ways that parents aren't necessarily seeing at home. These things are happening in school. These ODs are happening in school. Vaping is happening in schools. So what I'm saying is that it's really more important now than ever that parents establish a baseline that children of any age and at any stage can always check in a no judgment free zone, no matter what it is, because we've got to let our kids know that we are here to support them so that they can help to navigate this new wild, wild west. Because that's what this social media is. We don't know. There are no rules to this.
That's an excellent point. There's a question that says, how should we be navigating the digital landscape? If we're unplugged, then we aren't aware of what's going on. But the vast consumption of media, social media news, etc., is also influencing our fatigue and burnout. What should we be doing if we want to stay aware and updated without feeling overwhelmed?
I'm going to go with the dose policy. I'm not going to take away the phone or not watch the TV because at the heart of it, the original intent was good. We'll just acknowledge that for a minute. I still want to find out if there's a tornado warning, there's going to be a warning on TV. If something really critical is happening, I'm still going to engage in the media. So there was an original good intent to this. We have gotten into a zone where it's less filter. A filter becomes a thing that we have to acknowledge what is, but we get to use that filter. Baby aspirin is great. Too much baby aspirin can lead to too much bleeding. And that is the dose response I go. And we have the ability to use that remote appropriately as it works for our family. And that extends to when we tune into the Facebook scrolling, when our children get access to digital technology. So still maintaining that there is a good purpose to this. And we ultimately, with our fingertips, still remain in control of how and when we engage. And I think that's the best approach I've used until I find another one.
I think that's phenomenal. I'm going to combine two questions here because they really have what I'm reading to be the same intent about people burning out of professions and looking into career alternatives. What are some of our long-term implications, especially in service professions like teaching and nursing and social work? How do we rectify this? And also, how do we begin to remedy burnout based on your research and experience?
I'll say there's nothing wrong with changing careers and acknowledging that burnout does happen and it is real, and we have the ability to change. Thank goodness we are all in careers that affords us multiple different offshoots that we can be successful in. So first of all, acknowledging that if there's burnout, you don't need to force yourself to stay. There are some environments that are truly toxic, and there are organizations that will not and you have no intention of changing that for you. So that baseline, let's just be clear that changing career is something that you should actually look forward to. It's progress. At different stages in our life, we can choose a gentler form of, I might not want to work the night shift anymore. And if we're afforded that opportunity, we should take it. And that's a part of protecting ourselves from burnout. So that's one. But What was the second part of the question? Because I feel very passionate
Uh,
about changing careers. I'm not changing
okay.
mine yet though, but
That's really good because we have some work to do together here.
yes.
But based on your research and experience, how do we begin to remedy burnout?
So thank you. So I would like us to value our employees more, not individually. We have an expectation to go to work 8-hour, 12-hour shift and do a series of tasks to help others to be successful in different arenas, not just nursing. I'm not talking about nursing now. I'm talking about a career. It's usually filled with a series of tasks that we need to get done. Within that organization, even if you're self-employed, there needs to be some structure in which we take care of each other. Is it that we have a space where I can cry? Is it a chapel when I have to deal with a stillborn that I can go be? Those safeguards are not in place for too many places. When there is a difficult incident at school, is there a space that I can privately speak with a student? So some of it are simple structural changes that needs to happen. Added on to that is an approach, a philosophical approach about what is appropriate. Wellness, not mental health disorder. Wellness needs to be prioritized. And that is where I think we start changing this narrative about what is accepted and what is not. So this idea, if you're having a bad day, go home and do what? It's a question. What I'm telling you is that I'm having a bad day because of the environment that I'm in, and individuals within this environment are the ones that I want my support from. That is what I'm verbalizing to you. So I think we have some really low-hanging fruit that I think organizations, and I'm putting this on organizations, can do without a multi-million-dollar change to help us now. And the next piece is just having a change in mindset about what is accepted and what is not. We can have a variable work day. We don't need to be in at 7:30. It could be a 9 to 4. It could be a 10 to 3. And some realistic pieces about that. Why is it that some countries can have siestas and I don't? It's simple pieces like that that we see versions of it in other places. Some persons have a four-day work week. It's not rocket science, but those are the pieces that we need to start prioritizing. And the last piece I'll say about this is that when we or kids are in those positions, that is when we get to start implementing it. So it might not be implemented by the bosses we have now, but we can start to advocate for and make those structural changes. If not us, then who? And if not now, then when?
And the thing that I just want to add is having compassion for ourselves, and giving ourselves grace when things are difficult. You can't, if we don't give ourselves compassion, it's really hard to give it to somebody else and to keep our own tank full. I think that it's a really exhausting time, like we've talked about a number of pieces. And I think with intentional action, we can change. And how we pay our teachers, and even just thinking as a society, what do we value? How do we treat each other? The conversations are happening today more than ever, and I feel a sense of hope for the future looking forward.
So what I'd say is that, the irony of all of this is that while we are so connected more than ever, we also have a pandemic of loneliness happening, right? So people are feeling isolated more than ever. Researchers are really studying the impact of loneliness. And so what I would say is that we've got to encourage people to get connected in person to someone else, right? Good old-fashioned building of community is going to be very essential to helping to break down the barriers that keep fatigue high. Having community, going out to dinner, just having a walk together, looking forward to going to the movies. We need to find ways in which we can authentically build community so that we can get rejuvenated and restored. I don't believe that we were created to be alone. We were not created to be alone, in fact, right? So I think it's really important that we intentionally search for and create and then learn to sustain our communities. because far too many people right now are in the middle of this pandemic of loneliness. And I think that that is exacerbating certainly some of this fatigue.
Well, I would like to thank the three of you for sharing your expertise and your compassion as we have come together as a community this evening. I just want to return back some of the wonderful thoughts and pearls that you gave us, talking about notice and naming, normalizing, being aware of body work, the criticality of community, creating safe places, quiet and rest, and valuing that in the home, having a dose policy, and putting on your oxygen mask. So that's want to leave everyone with that hope and the pearls from this wonderful group of human beings who shared their expertise with us tonight. For more information on HEAT Corps and or the initiatives of the Office of Economic Development and Community Partnerships, make sure to follow at JH Connects and at JHH HEAT Corps on all your social platforms to stay updated, but only in a dose manner. Special thank you to our featured guest and to the JHU HEAT Corps team for providing this content. We have the absolute best I don't want to call them support staff because they really are I'd like to call them the engine that drive this, and they make all of this possible. Thank you to Johns Hopkins University and Medicine, the Johns Hopkins Health System, and Adoptions Together. Thank you all. May you have compassion and grace as you go forward, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.